So welcome back to another episode of both the podcast and the YouTube channel. And today I'm super excited to be joined by the lovely Emily Horton. And Emily has a really beautiful way with words, which is kind of incidentally what we're going to talk about. So Emily is the founder of More Diverse Voices. And today we're going to be chatting about inclusive language and how we can use that kind of in the workplace and I guess in life in general, really. So Emily, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be chatting with you. Obviously, we met on an accelerator program, Hatch. So it's nice just to be back and seeing your lovely face again, to be honest. Seeing it pop up on my screen like it used to.
Oh yeah, no, I do miss that. It was nice to
Yeah,
have that camaraderie and all the learning that we got from that accelerator was
I
amazing.
know
Wasn't it?
so much.
Awesome. Alrighty, so we're going to talk about inclusive language. So first kind of fairly obvious question is when we're talking about inclusive language, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I suppose like words, phrases that make people feel seen and heard. And I think one of the first things to think about with inclusive language is actually not just about inclusion. That's a big part of it. It's actually about power, and it's actually about the redistribution of power through the words that we use. So it's so much more than just kind of like, oh, that would be nice if that word was used. It's actually like indicating to that individual or that person that they are seen, heard, and respected. And I just think that's a very important, powerful, and beautiful thing.
How do people go about doing that in practice? Because those feel like quite big statements to me. So finding words where people feel seen, how do
Yeah.
people go about approaching that in practice?
Yes. I mean, well, so there are lots of kind of I suppose like guidelines and individual words that I could go through with you today, but I actually want to kind of not start with that, but kind of more introduce like a philosophy and an approach and a mindset to it than necessarily like this word is right and this word is wrong. And I want to start with that because another thing that's very important to think about when we consider inclusive language is that like our words, the way we use them and the way we use them like change over time, like and they will constantly change. And so we can sit here and we can discuss kind of like gender inclusive language or LGBTQ plus inclusive language or anti-racist language, or we can actually just also remember that things change over time, and that it's kind of important to acknowledge that, because otherwise we can get into a little bit of a hole sometimes whereby people are like, this is right and this is wrong. And there are definitely words where, I just would genuinely avoid, but it's more of a kind of like a sense and a feeling of trying and wanting to make a group of people feel included and represented through the types of words that we use. So yeah, it's hard. It's like, well, I could like sit here and list out like a loads of different types of words and like the different ones that we should be looking at, but also it's kind of like an approach and a mindset, and especially I think when we look at things that are considered right and wrong, that can make a lot of people very nervous. It can make people a bit scared to try, and instead of embracing kind of the fact that we might get something wrong, but we can always correct ourselves. And it's the process of, I suppose, like being okay with firstly being corrected. If say someone puts their hand up and says, actually I would prefer if you use this word, or to describe this group, or as an individual this is how I like to be described, and kind of being okay with being corrected and being in that space where I'm like, oh, I hear you, really sorry that I've used that word. I didn't mean it in an offensive way. Let's find a way forward and use a word that you feel represented by. So yeah, I'll stop there because I could go on about kind of that for a while.
I think I completely agree with what you said. It's probably much easier to have like an approach as opposed to like a list of good words and bad words, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I think in my kind of HR work, we often talk about another concept that you talked about, how things change over time and how
Mhm.
it's so hard to know like what you can say and what you can't say. Like or what you shouldn't, maybe those are the wrong words to be using as
Yeah,
well.
no,
You know
exactly.
what I
Even
mean?
that it is even that is like framing in this like right and wrong, and for me it's more like I want to encourage people to try to shift their mindset when it comes to inclusive language. And I think a lot of people are put off because they're scared of getting it quote unquote wrong or right and being called out. And actually we need to, the first thing is about creating an inclusive an environment where firstly people feel like they could point something out and say, hi, you know, just so you know, I'd prefer if it was like these pronouns, or this, we didn't use the acronym BAME, we used something else, and this is the reason why. Firstly, how then the individual who is either I would say being called in, not being called out, so being called in and invited to kind of into this space as well, also how they react to that feedback. And just that it's how we create that environment that I'm particularly interested in, as well as kind of like thinking about different terms and their history, and how that may have shifted and changed over time, and why, particularly within a corporate setting, how that also might be slightly different from when you're with your friends or when you're at home. Like, it is a slightly different situation, and that's where the kind of like individual preferences and like what I like to be referred to versus like a kind of company-wide policy on the language that you use is important to differentiate, and to kind of be clear on as well. And when you're in, I suppose, the business world and corporate world, it is better to be it's more advisable to be as inclusive as possible, and to kind of go out of your way and kind of, I suppose, like corporate comms and things that go out into the world, and the way that we speak about different minoritized groups, versus like sometimes as an individual someone might refer to themselves in a way that might be confusing for someone else, but that doesn't mean that as a corporation or a business or an organization that should also like be included. Does that make sense? It's like there's a difference between the individual and then also like a company-wide approach to inclusive language, which I would definitely err on the kind of like side of thinking about in a as inclusively as you possibly can.
So you were talking about companies being able to create spaces where people felt comfortable to be kind of called in.
Yes.
So what advice would you give to companies who want to kind of create that kind of environment? Because I must say, I speak to a lot of clients where they totally want to do the right thing, but they're not 100% sure what the right thing is. A little bit like you said,
Yeah.
they don't want to offend or anything, but that what I love is that will and drive is there to want to do something. It's just not necessarily knowing the how of what they should be doing.
Yeah, like a really, so I totally understand that. And sometimes these things can feel intangible, but they're not. So a lot of this comes back down to something called psychological safety, which is like, how much do I feel like I can take a risk in front of someone else?
Mhm.
And in, I suppose, like incredibly hierarchical Machiavellian organizations which are essentially full of shame and full of like pointing the finger and blame, someone might feel incredibly uncomfortable to come forward and share their experience, or like especially if someone is more senior than them or in a position of power. There are ways to the ways to do this. I think showing it has to kind of be exhibited at a leadership level, so kind of this say, like, first of all, saying and doing, so like saying that we want to create an inclusive environment, and then going out of your way across policies and practices, and then everyday interactions between different people, and to kind of evidence that you want to create an inclusive culture. One way that is like incredibly powerful and very simple is to put your pronouns, to normalize putting pronouns at the end of your email signature, or in your Slack name, or wherever it is, just to kind of signify to and particularly the LGBTQ plus community, people who are non-binary, people who are trans, that this is a inclusive environment for all genders. And that's really powerful because it just becomes normalized and like part of the culture. And then you don't have to, as an individual, like constantly be re-saying your gender pronouns, because it's just there by your name, and then they know that you are, she, he, or they, them. And it kind of takes the I suppose awkwardness out of it, or the kind of like, oh gosh, out of it. So like that's one very kind of simple way to kind of show and demonstrate that. Another way, a thing that I think everyone just needs to get better at is how to do a good apology. So how to apologize well. And there is a kind of communication style, it's called nonviolent communication, and there's like this structure and this format that you can follow. And normally it's kind of like, first thing is to always show that you've actively listened to the person and you can see that you have caused them some form of pain, and acknowledge the pain, and to be, I suppose, like as specific as possible about it. So not just to be like vague, oh, I'm sorry. It's like, I can see that this has upset you because of X. I suppose it's a reason, not an excuse, is also something. I'm giving lots of different advice. Sorry, it's all coming out. So then to give a reason, not an excuse. So sometimes there's like you may have genuinely like messed up, or I can give an example. Like I kept on getting someone's name wrong, like and I just felt terrible because I had just given a talk on like how saying some, or like mentioned that how saying someone's name wrong over and over and again can be construed as a microaggression, or as a like, yeah, like I can't remember. Yeah, so as a microaggression essentially, or and how that over time can really get to someone if that person's name is constantly mispronounced, and it because people, it's not as a common name as maybe other names are. And I felt really bad, and I knew that I directly apologized to her, to be like, I'm sorry that I got your name wrong. I'm dyslexic, and I just kept on reading it like a bit, like it got into my head that it was either this letter and this letter. I know how to say your name, but I also want to acknowledge that like that can be frustrating if it's happening a lot. And I will, try to not do it again, and I haven't since, because I've learned how to say it and now it's in my brain. But that followed a kind of like acknowledging the kind of upset or the pain that may have been caused, explaining but not excusing, so giving a reason but not excusing, and then finding a way forward with that other person. So like that's also a like learning how to say sorry or apologizing, and then moving on, so there's no more like resentment or insecurity, or like, there's nothing bubbling under the surface.
Are there any great examples of brands that you feel get inclusive communication right? And I suppose what I'm not saying is that
Yeah.
the way that those brands do it is the way that everyone should. I'm very passionate that companies should be kind of true to their company DNA. But I guess
Yes.
for our
Yeah.
listeners, are there any brands that, from your perspective, get it right? And I guess what lessons can people learn from those brands when they think about inclusive language?
Great question. One that's just popping into my head that I think did particularly well over Pride last year was North Face. Um, and again, so this kind of boils also down to, so like they did a campaign which was focused on led by this incredible drag queen, which was all about like getting out into the outside, like getting out, going for walks, hiking, building community specifically for LGBTQ plus people. And they were just very mindful about their approach and all of the different things that they did, in terms of the language that they used, the branding, the campaign message, but then also actually following it up with like investing in the community, creating events that were specifically for like, getting outside and going walking. It made sense because there's a big connection between the lesbian community and hiking, and there's like this historic community and connection there. And So as much as it also was, that I think they did well in terms of like how they communicated it, they followed it up with investment into that specific group as well. And didn't, like, there were, as with every kind of pride campaign, you will get anti-LGBTQ plus critics coming forward and not saying particularly nice things about these groups. And then sometimes what happens is brands U-turn and they will abandon that group. And it's so important not to do that, because it actually makes the problem worse. It's like you're abandoning this group. If you're going to try and sell products and services and create a whole advertising campaign around that, and then you turn on it because another group of your customer profile have, gotten aggressive or threatened the organization, like that is when you double down. And like it's or you don't actually get involved in this type of work. Like I don't think you're truly inclusive then. And actually what you need to do is, as much as we're talking about inclusive language, it's also about inclusive action. So it's all well and good to say some of these things, to have these words, to have this list of words that we use, and how we communicate like a brand's message and how it aligns. But if you're not actually going to also stand by the things that you say you're going to do, then that's actually really harmful. So yeah, so for me, it comes back to what I just said. It's not about inclusive language, it's about inclusive action.
And what about taking that a step further? How can organisations educate people within their organisation about using inclusive language? What ways can they kind of push that message, and how can they do that authentically as well? Because I guess make people be a certain way, but you also do want them to buy into the way that the company works, provided that's ethical, obviously.
Yes.
But what can they do there? Sorry, I know that's a bit of a broad question.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a tricky one. Is it tricky? Well, I think one of the first things that we all need to do is to understand our own power and privilege, and to understand a concept called intersectionality and how different identities layer on top of one another. And that means that certain groups of people might have more power and privilege because of their identities. You might have less because of like your compounded identities. And like the most important thing is to start with yourself and to understand, okay, I am white, so I understand that I get a significant amount of privilege in kind of this Western white world that is based off, has been created off kind of colonialism and the slave trade, and that means that as a white person, I understand that there are certain things, there are biases, like my own biases, but then also the world is biased towards me as well. Or if I am a man, I understand that this world that has been constructed around my needs, and so that might disadvantage other people, other women, or other non-binary people, because this world has been built around me and my needs. And or there's like wealth or education, like all of these different intersecting identities, and fully understanding that, like, fully understanding yourself first, and then but also really importantly understanding that like privilege in and of itself is not a bad thing. Like we are some people are born with a certain amount of privilege. You might gain a certain amount of privilege over your lifetime. It isn't a bad thing to have privilege. I think what becomes problematic is when people don't begin to like understand how that when people lack empathy or understanding for other people in different situations and can't put themselves, or refuse to put themselves, or can't be bothered to do the work to put themselves in other people's shoes. And so so that's a very long-winded way to say start with yourself and your own privilege, and understand your own identity and how you might have less privilege in some places and more privilege in others. And then once that's kind of done, I think also then understanding the importance of allyship and why like we need really good allies across all different, like, kind of supporting across all different identities, because Oh my gosh, otherwise it's so tiring for that specific marginalized group to constantly be fighting that fight. And we need other people to be able to understand the kind of like systems of oppression and also like be doing good work within that space to be undoing, building systems that make things fairer for everyone. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to always be that person that's impacted by it, but like, and lots of people who have lived experience of that specific kind of marginalization or oppression will probably be incredibly passionate about it because we understand, we only really understand ourselves, we only can fully because that's the only body we live in. But then when you begin to include things like, you know, start to be empathetic and understand other people's perspectives and experiences, then that's why allyship is so important, because you know, we can't just expect marginalized groups to be doing all this really, really intense justice-based work.
Mm.
Um, so, and then once that's kind of like explained, which is a big thing, it's for some people, it's a big mindset shift thing. Then you can begin to introduce like word, like understanding of like why you should be considering using one word instead of another, because I think the most important thing, and maybe lots of this part gets skipped sometimes, and then also that's why people might feel like, well, I don't need to know this, like this doesn't apply to me, or this is silly or unnecessary, is because they don't understand the why, because they don't understand why things are, it's so important, because they don't understand that there's like a you know, an unfair distribution of resources based on kind of, you know, pretty much chance, or you know, like we're just born into the bodies that we're born into, and then you kind of inherit a situation, and that yeah, like that's not fair. And I would like to live in a world where everyone is given you know, equal opportunity to flourish and to live happy, healthy and fulfilled lives. And yeah, so I think that is, that's the main kind of point, but it's really big because it's basically like you have to explain the why, and to explain the why you have to start with ourselves, because also I think if we start with ourselves, it's quite empowering, because when you understand yourself, I think then some of the big things, which is like, I don't know how to change this world, like, but you are in control of your own actions, you are in control of the people that you interact with, how you spend your money, how you spend your time, how you the causes you support, like you are in control of that, and cumulatively that can have a huge effect. So I'll stop there.
So tell me a little bit about whether you think it's important in recruitment processes for people to use inclusive language. Is that something that you think businesses should be bothered about and thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, well, number one, that's like one of the, it's maybe like the second point of engagement, or like, you know, if someone is being recruited, they've seen a job advert, that's maybe the first port of call. That's really important because it's been shown that inclusive language, particularly around, I think, like gender neutral language in job advertisements, actually increases the number of like female identifying people to a job application, but it doesn't necessarily decrease the amount of men who would apply for that role. So you see lots of examples across lots of different data sets which show that gender neutral language increases the kind of pool of candidates that are applying for jobs, if it was compared to, like, you know, maybe using quote unquote typically masculine language, like, you know, aggressive sales tactic or whatever that might be, which yeah, so like I think that's a super important thing, because like it will increase the pool of candidates that you have, and lots of organizations say that like it's a big pipeline issue, and pipeline is one, you know, of like finding the right talent and attracting them to the wanting to apply in the first place is one of the big problems that they are facing in terms of attracting candidates. And that's a really simple, straightforward way that is very easy to do and is reasonably, you know, there are even kind of like programs that will, like, you can put CVs into, and, or not CVs, you know, job application forms into, and it will come back and it will highlight and give you different recommendations and suggestions for that. And then I suppose it's also like, you know, you're not just interviewing the person, like that is their first impression of your company, the culture. Like that is one of the places where they'll get a feel, that candidate will get a feel for that organization and if they want to work there. And like if inclusive language isn't a priority, you'll be losing out on loads of talent that like that is a really, you know, important thing for them. And then there are other things that go kind of beyond just, I suppose, the recruitment. It goes into culture, but like inclusive language has been shown as well to like promote things like better well-being, increased belonging, better decision making and a better decision making process, even building better interpersonal relationships between different people. So there's loads of reasons why recruitment, and then also, you know, people who are building the cultures of organizations should be like, yeah, I suppose prioritizing inclusive
I
language.
guess another point for me is, how can businesses be authentic in trying to make sure they're using inclusive language? So I guess what I mean is, sometimes I see companies trying to be inclusive and it just doesn't, it feels like a box ticking exercise. It doesn't
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
like
yeah.
that's what they're actually, do you know what I mean? There's something
Because
inauthentic about
because
it.
it probably is. Like, let's be honest. Because, and for me, there's something I'm so passionate about is that the and the internal, the external has to reflect the internal. So
Mhm.
like you can't just like jump a stage and be like, we're an inclusive company. Look at all these really inclusive images that we have of our, you know, workers, or here's you know, some super inclusive words that we're using in this like product that we have. And if the product itself or the service itself doesn't have that in mind, like that community or group in mind, it can feel disingenuous. There can be a mismatch between like what is being said and actually what is being done. And I think that is where people feel icky. And there was a survey done by Google about building consumer trust and customer trust, and it's something very similar that they acknowledged in terms of like when there was like a mismatch between what went out externally and what was going on internally culturally, and that consumers kind of know, customers know, they you know can tell that it isn't quite sitting right. So like the only way around that is to do the work, and that's when you need to talk to equality, diversity, and inclusion consultants who focus on internal policies and practices. That's when, you know, you have to get your gender pay gap, you know, in line. That's when you have to, you know, think about your hiring practices, and then also the products and services that you create. Communication is an incredibly important part of all of this, but actually, it's not the least, but it's like it's at the end of the process. You know, you have to have done the work before you then start talking about it. And I think like there's a mismatch between those two things sometimes, and that's what people feel.
And when people are doing that work, are they, what do you kind of recommend that people need to think about specific groups, or is there a way that people can just be inclusive across the board in terms
Yeah. Oh gosh.
of, I'm asking
I
big
think
questions.
there's a good baseline that I think is kind of like, this is how you treat your staff. This is how, you know, we interact with people on at a kind of like day-to-day level. Then so what's interesting is sometimes though, if you're so there's a little, oh gosh, I don't know how to say this well. It's a good question. Like sometimes the product itself like just doesn't serve that market. Like sometimes the thing that's being sold, it would be a bit strange if like, you know, because like it isn't create it wasn't hasn't been created for that specific group of people, and like shouting about it doesn't actually like it doesn't actually lead to sales or engagement. It could potentially like make the problem worse by alienating that group further. So actually it's about like the product and service that has been built, and if that is authentically for that community and that group. And if there's a mismatch there, then yeah, like that, like yeah, that again, it can be it can feel a bit unnatural or a bit weird. Natural, I don't know if that's the right word. It can feel inauthentic. And yeah, so I think that's what you're kind of
Mm,
describing.
mm, mm.
And so sometimes it isn't appropriate for organizations to be you know, talking in that talking in that way. But I do think every business should have a kind of like diverse group of people working for them, and they should be striving for treating them equally and creating an environment where all of those people can flourish and communicating that to them. So maybe it's more of a like an internal thing, and that's also fine. What's interesting as well is when, say, if there's like an industry that's really, really, I don't know, has a bias within its hiring process, and is it, you know, looks a certain way, or is you know, made up of a very specific type of people, they also then need to, I would like to see more organizations being like, okay, how are we going to try and change this? Like how can I make a fairer, better world where our business doesn't look like that? Like how can I strive to be creating a world that is gives everyone the equal opportunity to work at an organization like this? How do we do that? And then, yeah, I would like more companies to do that, whether that's on their, like, you know, to-do list, is where it can get, yeah, again, icky. I don't know if it's the right word, but they might be like, that's not a priority. It's not our responsibility to kind of change the world in that way. But I think it is. I think it's all of our individual responsibilities and collective responsibilities. And I, to an extent, not disagree with, like, you know, a lot of EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, is positioned as, oh, it will increase innovation. Oh, you've got a bigger market to sell to. Oh, you know, you will have increased diversity of thought. And to a certain extent, there's truth in, you know, some of these studies, and things that people say. But also, I just think that, like, when that doesn't happen, or like, when, you know, we haven't seen a 10x rise because a woman is leading the company, and therefore she has failed because we were promised innovation, like, that's when people go back on their commitments and their promises. And I just think we should be trying to create, it should just be enough to be like, I want equality. Like, it shouldn't have to, there shouldn't always have to be a reason for the business. Like, the reason should just be to create a just, equal, and fair world. And yeah, I don't know if that's always, I don't know if that is in essentially capitalism's best interest. You know, like, if we're going like up here, it isn't necessarily in capitalism's best interest to make things fair. And so it's like, what do we do then?
One of the things that you mentioned was kind of potential tools, and it kind of made me think that back in the day when I worked in recruitment, there was a particular piece of software, I can't remember what it was, but we used to put our job adverts through it to make sure that it didn't include any of the kinds of language that you were talking about. And whilst I'm not saying people doing the work is just finding pieces of software, are there any particular kind of tools or places that you think people can go to help with them when they're doing the work?
Yeah, I think there are lots of amazing guidelines, and like guidelines that have been produced by specifically organizations that like work in, say, like anti-racism spaces, or like, I don't know, Mind, for example, have a really good one around mental health, and the words, advice around like what to use when talking about like suicide, or other like forms of mental health. And so like, there are different, I would say Mind's one's really good. There are lots of just articles that are available. I can probably share a list with you. I do have like a list of resources. Another one that's coming into like my mind is this AI powered tool called WittyWorks. Sorry, is it WittyWorks or Witty Words? I can't remember. Maybe it's WittyWorks. It's a German tool that highlights language, and you can like input documents into it. It gives you alternatives and suggestions and recommendations. And what was that for me? That was really useful, just to challenge my way that I write. And like, I would put in articles in there, or like things that I'd written, and see different colors come up, and each one would have an explainer and an alternative as to like maybe consider this, or maybe like use XYZ. And that I found that from a kind of like just from an experimental point of view of like, as you said, a learning point of view, to see like, oh, how is my writing biased? Because it was, and it is, and like it, I will continue to, I don't like, I will probably continue to have some type of bias within my own writing, like even as someone who works in diversity, equality, and inclusion. But I will do my best to try and remove that, and to keep on learning. And that's also a really big point, is that like, I don't like, we can begin to unlearn biases, but new biases come in, and we also forget. We're just forgetful, sometimes we forget we have done all of this incredible training on, I don't know, like neurodiversity, or an incredible session on anti-racism, and then we just exist in the world and we forget. And that's why it's really, really important for this to be like a yearly training thing. Like, it isn't just this kind of like, you've done it, well done, well, you're never going to have any of those biased thoughts again. Because you won't, because that's not the way that people's brains work. But if you're, and like, so it has to be like little and often. And that's why I actually really like following different creators, different people on LinkedIn, different people on actually, I don't even use Instagram, basically just LinkedIn, who help me, who are incredible, and are thinkers within this space, and just to like remind me about stuff. Because I, as much as like, these big kind of terrifying books, like sometimes it's good to sit down and to be with a book and see it through. But like, I don't know how accessible that is for lots of people. Like telling someone, like, if that might be someone's preference to go away and read a book and get super nerdy about all the different kind of LGBTQ plus terms that there are. I do have a book on that. But for other people, that is not how they want to be spending their time. So actually, like, some stuff that's little and often, and following other creators that are in that space and doing that work, is something that I found particularly useful. And I can give kind of a list of recommendations. Like, one that's coming to mind, who is excellent, is this person called Lily Zheng. And they are an equality, diversity, and inclusion consultant, but they just write so profoundly on so much stuff. And they're like kind of like little essays each, like mini essays, not too long, but like really useful stuff to just get you thinking. So following other people as well, and just surrounding yourself with kind of the little and often approach, I think has been the most transformational for me, because I'm forgetful. So
As am I.
exactly. And that's okay. We're just human beings. We can't be expected to ingest like huge amounts of information, and also unlearn years and years of socialization. But we can do things each day. We can keep on reminding ourselves. And then we can also kind of like, if we don't get something quite right, we can forgive ourselves. And also, hopefully, we live in an environment where other people forgive us as well. And that's kind of like, hopefully, a shift away from cancel culture, and kind of like the polarization that you see online, in terms of like, just like the left and the right. Like, that's not doing the left and the right. Like, that's not not useful either. And it's like, how do we create space? It comes back to what we were talking about before. How do we create spaces where these discussions can happen, and that it isn't a shouting match, and that there is genuine kind of like compassion and empathy for each other's experiences, and to see where that gets us to.
So if people want to tap into your brain and get a little bit of support from you,
Goodness, my brain is available. Yeah. So you can follow me on LinkedIn, or add me on LinkedIn, at Emily Horton. Our website is More Diverse Voices. And yeah, those are the two spaces that I think you can find me in. It's really interesting. I work in comms, but I deleted Instagram and Facebook like 5 years ago now. And like, oh, that was a really big thing for me, because I found kind of like like this, I just found like me being online in that way like wasn't very good for my mental health. But I really like LinkedIn because of I like the kind of like professional element to it. I think also people are better behaved on LinkedIn because it's literally linked to their CV, and they're not like, you know, gonna send you weird, creepy messages as much. Though though it has happened still on LinkedIn, but it's less, so that's good.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been
You're
really nice.
welcome.
I always get really gutted. I always try and choose people where I know we're going to have a lovely conversation, and genuinely people that I like. So then I get to the end and I'm like, oh.
Oh, it's ended.
Yeah.
It's over.